Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 40+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify innovative applications, build skills and standards, and advance partnerships to solve global challenges. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this series. And my name is Lily Xu. I'm happy to be co-organizing this with Dave Thao and Sara Beery. And very happy that today I get to be moderating this discussion with Sara herself. So Dr. Sara Beery is the Homer A. Bernal Career Development Professor in the MIT Faculty of AI and Decision Making. She received her PhD at Caltech, where she was advised at Pietro Verona. And her work broadly works on computer vision methods that enable global scale environmental and biodiversity monitoring across data modalities, tackling real-world challenges, including geospatial and temporal domain shift, learning from imperfect data, fine-grained categories, and long-tail distributions. Her work has been recognized with many accolades, including a Schmidt Sciences AI 2050 Early Career Fellowship, Amori Doctoral Prizes, and others. And she is very much a leader in the space of AI for conservation through both her research and service to the community, such as the AI for Conservation Slack that many of you are likely on, serving as biodiversity lead for climate change AI, and the founding and co-directing the workshop on CB methods for ecology. So, Sara, very excited to learn from you today about multimodal AI.
Thank you, Lily. It's so fun to get to have this conversation with you. So I'm going to start by just kind of going through what I see as maybe a high-level picture of what it means to think about AI that harnesses the value of different modalities of data for biodiversity monitoring. And so just to set the stage, I think the reason that multimodal AI potentially bears so much promise for biodiversity is because of the inherently multimodal structure of the data we already collect to try to understand the world and the species in it. And this is just sort of a subset of all of the different modalities of data that are already being collected, processed and analyzed to try to understand biodiversity and trends and change. These include everything from sort of mobile sensors like satellites, low-flying aircraft or UAVs that are capturing sort of high resolution or different modalities of aerial footage, things like hyperspectral data, LiDAR, as well as sensors directly on animals, so movement ecology. And then beyond that, we also look at large-scale networks of stationary sensors. So these could be things like camera traps, passive acoustic monitoring, that are tracking sort of longitudinally, but in very sort of small spatial scales, what's going on, interactions between species, sort of occupancy, but also things like behavior. And then increasingly, we also rely on community science data. And community science data, this could be things like eBird or iNaturalist, has really shown a huge potential for scale as we sort of move beyond sort of the traditional sense of sensors and think about how humans themselves, passionate volunteers, can actually be the sensing system. It really does expand what is kind of possible to collect at scale, but it also introduces a bunch of new complexities and challenges. And I think one of the things that is sort of so exciting about this is that all of these different modalities are somehow complementary. But I think one of the challenges is that none of them is sort of sufficient alone, right? There's sort of no modality of data that captures everything we want to understand about biodiversity across the taxonomic tree, across spatial scale and temporal scale. simultaneously. And so I think one of the kind of known challenges when we think about trying to understand biodiversity, particularly globally, is that the distribution of biodiversity and the distribution of data we have about biodiversity are pretty different from each other. So here on the left, you can see like an estimated map of alpha diversity, sort of the number of unique species there are any place on Earth. On the right, this is a heat map of all of the species occurrence data in GBIF, which I think is a reasonable proxy for sort of the set of data that we actually have. And you can see they're almost anti-correlated. And then another important thing to note is both of these things are a fixed map that are aggregated over time, right? And so you also have these kind of different, both different distributions of alpha diversity over time, but also a big fall off in data when we think about going back in time where we had less access to these types of sensors or the sensors were more expensive. And so that really limits our ability to understand trends over time, right? Because we don't have the same information in the past that we do now in the future. But beyond just this kind of like high level, okay, here's all the occurrence data that we have, and here's this map of alpha diversity. There's kind of this fascinating kind of additional complexity that gets introduced when you think about how different sensing modalities actually capture their own kind of unique and heterogeneous sampling distributions. So here on the top, we're looking at iNaturalist data. You can see some examples of kind of human captured images of bobcats. And if you look at the map of kind of where iNaturalist data is distributed, you can see it's pretty well aligned with population centers, but it also has some bias in terms of maybe like developing versus developed world. If you think about satellite imagery in the middle, you can see that you really don't have those same spatial biases. So, you know, satellite data is kind of explicitly often capturing the entire globe. Though, of course, like with some of the more recent, very high resolution satellites, they're actually being actively tasked. So they're only collecting data sort of where people are paying for it, which again leads to a bias of that very high resolution data towards often places where people are financially interested in collecting it. But the challenge with satellite imagery is you can only see what you can see from the air, right? And so there's kind of these limitations in terms of what is possible to capture. Though I do have to say that the spatial scale and the temporal frequency of visit really do mean that satellite imagery poses a huge amount of promise for what we're actually able to expand and scale in terms of our analysis. And then if we look at things like you know, static sensors like camera traps. Here you can see sort of the distribution of camera trap data in Wildlife Insights. So this map is a little out of date. It's actually expanded coverage a bit. And I think there you start to see these interesting complementarities. So if you look at the iNat distribution versus the Wildlife Insights distribution, you can see that kind of these static networks of sensors are almost prioritized to be where humans aren't, right? Part of the value of these is that you can put them out in remote areas and they'll collect information where you don't necessarily have human presence. So there's clearly like kind of differences and complementarities just in terms of the way that we are actually getting information from these different modalities. But even if you dig into a single modality, you realize that it is also capturing kind of a biased picture of the taxonomic tree. So, for example, if we think about camera traps, often camera traps use a PIR sensor, some sort of passive infrared sensor to detect and then sample data. And this means that even from any given camera trap, you're going to be biased towards things that are likely to trigger that PIR sensor, which is based on a difference in temperature between the foreground and background. These sensors are more likely to detect large things that are hot and much less likely to detect small things that are maybe cold-blooded, like reptiles. And you can expand this analogy to kind of any modality, right? Aerial drone footage is much more likely to be able to detect things that don't like to hang out under the tree canopy. Acoustic signals are going to detect things that are loud. There's kind of these complex inherent biases just in terms of what is actually captured from any of these modalities across the taxonomic tree. So it's a bit of a mess, But I think it's an exciting mess because clearly they're not capturing duplicative information. There's clearly different information captured in these different modalities that arguably we should be able to bring together. And there is a really amazing, deep literature in ecology in terms of thinking about how to actually understand these biases, model them effectively so that they can be normalized. And you can actually do something like take, a network of camera traps and a network of passive acoustic sensors, detect species in each of them, and then combine those different species detections effectively, handling the biases appropriately to model something like the overall occupancy across a larger set of species in an area. So there is a good body of work taking a more traditional statistical approach to this. But what I would like to talk about today is how and in what ways machine learning models and the machine learning community is thinking about modalities and multimodality, and how some of these things I think are going to influence and change the way that we think about multimodal modeling in ecology. And so the question is kind of, can we build AI systems that are able to share information and benefit from information across these different diverse modalities of data? And so the first option I want to bring up, option one, is one thing you can do is you can think about using one modality of data as the training signal to train a model for another modality of data. So a great example of this that's sort of being done pretty broad scale is this idea that you could actually identify species or crop types in aerial data, which tends to have broader spatial coverage, by using ground level data as the training signal. So known locations of observations on the ground as the signal to train something from space, where you might not be able to actually, from a satellite image or from a drone image, label the occurrence of that species accurately without that ground level confirmation. So one cool example of this is a recent paper by Lauren Gillespie that looks at actually modeling rapid plant species changes from satellite imagery, from remote sensing data, but they're leveraging iNaturalist observations as the training signal to be able to pick up on these fine-grained spatial and temporal changes. Another example is not just looking at the observations on the ground, but actually looking at the imagery on the ground. In this case, like street view imagery or images collected from people on motorcycles, the GoPro on their head, on their helmet, and then using machine learning to identify, for example, crop species in that ground level imagery. So you have one level of AI-based processing, and then trying to map those signals using some clever distance estimation to some sort of ground point so that you can actually improve our ability to map crop types from satellite imagery around the world. And this is kind of a very active area of research as well. So you can either use direct observations on the ground, something like an eBird checklist or an iNaturalist observation, or you can think about actually building a machine learning model that recognizes the species you care about on in imagery on the ground, and then using, or audio, and then using that as that training signal for satellite data. And I think a lot of these approaches are really kind of harnessing the fact that maybe it's easier to identify and verify in one modality, but the other modality is captured at a broader scale. And so the potential to maybe extrapolate is high. So option two is one step beyond that. And it's not just using one modality as training signal for another. It's actually thinking about building models for multiple modalities, and then you're looking at agreement across those modalities to increase the performance of your overall system. So an example of this is some work that I did in my PhD, where we were using Google Street View imagery of trees in cities, as well as remote sensing. This was mostly high resolution, low-flying aircraft data of those same trees to actually improve our ability to build large-scale tree census maps. And so here we were using per modality machine learning models plus a learned mixture of experts to essentially get the best of both worlds, to increase our ability to make confident predictions or disambiguate complicating cases. I think a nice example of this that's quite intuitive for me is particularly thinking about identifying palm trees from a lot of ground level imagery, because the palm tree is so tall, it kind of just looks like a telephone pole. And so you need that satellite image or that aerial image to get actually the structure and the shape of the crown of the tree, which is maybe its most identifying feature. And this is actually also the motivation behind this work by Grant Van Horn that was looking at multimodal bird species prediction. There, they're looking at images plus audio to be able to identify birds. And the intuition here, again, is that it's sometimes easier in one modality than another. So for example, for the difference between American crows and common ravens, it's super easy to tell them apart in audio signals, but they look very similar. And then again, yellow warblers versus chestnut-sided warblers, they look super different, but they sound very similar. And so here, if you have both modalities and you can learn across them, it really can help in these difficult cases, these kind of fine-grained, difficult to identify cases. And then the third kind of option that the machine learning community has been taking when you're thinking about sharing information across these modalities is this idea of multimodal representation learning. So not, just using one modality to train another or looking at the agreement across modalities from sort of unimodal models, but actually jointly training models that are representing information across those modalities directly. And this is definitely still somewhat a work in progress in terms of like what is the right way actually structurally within the machine learning architectures and within the loss functions to do this well. But there are some great examples of work in this space. So one, and this is maybe one of the first of now many different geospatial foundation models that are trying to learn across many different remote sensing modalities, SAR, Sentinel, Landsat, optical imagery at super high resolutions. But this model, Presto, is sort of taking in many different modalities of data and then using some clever training techniques to build representations, kind of useful embeddings that capture a lot of valuable semantic information for a given place and time on Earth that then can be used downstream for things like crop type mapping, land cover classification, tree canopy height, et cetera. And so there's been a huge push in this space, particularly from corporations. I think many of the kind of large tech companies are now working on developing their own multimodal foundation models, specifically from different modalities of aerial observation. And then you can actually think about learning aerial to ground representations as well. And so this is some recent work called Taxobind, where they're actually learning joint representations across ground level imagery, GPS locations, satellite imagery, the taxonomic structure of the species that was actually identified, audio, and kind of global environmental features like covariates. And here they're using a binding approach where they're kind of binding all of those representations to the image representation. And then they show that they get some improvement in terms of species identification, et cetera. But I think one of the things that's been kind of challenging and frustrating is that often these expensive to train, highly complex systems don't necessarily give us sufficient benefit over a simple unimodal model to kind of justify the complexity. And to me, this just means we're not doing it right yet. Because I think there is clearly different information being captured in these different modalities. And this means that I think the architectures, the methods that we're using to try to share that information or harness that information are pretty suboptimal. So I think there's a lot of exciting room to improve when we look at this. But then the elephant in the room here is language, because we can think a lot about kind of how you share information across all these modalities, but it would be very naive to ignore the fact that deep learning and AI is having a complete revolution in the way that the methodology is changing, specifically around the ability to model language. And so I'm sure many of you at this point in your life have interacted with large language models and generative AI, right? These LLMs are algorithms that are trained on extensive text data, so internet scale text data, to be able to comprehend and generate human-like language. And there are many examples, ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, et cetera, of these types of models that are now accessible to almost anyone. And this has really started, we really started to see that this ability to model language is really pushing the boundaries of the way that we do most things, manufacturing, thinking about writing code or writing text, or thinking about like, what is the role of humans within sort of a corporation or within some sort of collaboration. And I am maybe like a healthy skeptic in many ways about what these models can and can't do. But I do think that this community, the ecological and the biodiversity community, should be keeping up with what's going on, because I do see some areas where I think this will have a really large impact and pretty quickly. But what do these LLMs know about ecology right now? Earlier this year, Oisin McGay and some of their students tried to actually probe this systematically. So they went in and they used sort of different LLMs, and they prompted this model. Okay, for species X, so for some species, can you predict species presence, range maps, threat assessment, trait identification? Can you list the threatened species in a region? And then they actually systematically evaluated how much these models were able to actually capture some of this type of information. And what they found is that while these models could assist in accelerating certain conservation-related tasks, and they could definitely be used to make ecological information that's already available more accessible, there were significant limitations, and those suggested that they weren't quite ready for direct application in biodiversity decision-making. Essentially, these models were just not as good as kind of carefully curated expertise in terms of these types of things. An example of what that looks like, one of the things they asked the models to do was generate a polygon of the range of a given species. And you can see that versus the expert range maps, which are in blue, these are pretty weird. So there's a long way to go here. But I think that it's a shorter ramp than we might expect. And this also isn't the only way that we can think about the value of language in ecology, right? Generative LLMs is only one way that we can think about language being useful. So the other dimension of multimodality in language that I do want to bring up is this idea of not generative language models or vision language models, but these joint embedding models. So similar to the taxobind model I brought up before, there are also models in machine learning that try to jointly represent capture semantics in images and in text. So how this might work is, for example, you have some multimodal AI model that's jointly embedding text and images, like CLIP, which is a pretty commonly used one. So now if you take, a huge number, let's say all 290 million images in iNaturalist, you can actually generate these representations, and then now you have some representation for every image. And then you can use that multimodal AI model to embed any open-ended text query. So anything that you're interested in. And now you have a shared embedding space between language and images that you can use to re-rank or rank the similarity of text to images. And this doesn't sound that cool, but actually this unlocks a lot of value, particularly when you think about interacting with data at very large scale. Because now what this means is you can use essentially just nearest neighbors ranking to find images that are likely to correspond to any text query you can imagine. And because it's open-ended, because it's capturing sort of open-ended language, this means that instead of needing to think about training a custom classification model for finding California condors tagged with the green 26 that requires like training and test data, instead, you can actually just do it zero shot. Zero shot for us means you don't need to retrain anything. And so the computational cost at usage time is super, super lightweight, and it doesn't require a lot of expertise to kind of get this added value. And so what does this mean? Well, one thing that we've been looking at in terms of how this type of language plus modality embedding might impact biodiversity is just enabling open-ended search in large-scale databases. So we've been working with iNaturalist, and we've been exploring sort of how good these models are at identifying, finding, and surfacing to a user relevant data for these pretty complex, scientifically minded queries, things like, averted osmoterium, which is a term that I did not know before, but is a specific defensive mechanism of some species of caterpillars. And so we've now tested this. We think that there's room to improve on the methodology side and on the model side, but we also think that the models are good enough to use in many cases. And the reason is because you can set this up as something where the model is surfacing potential matches to a human, and then a human does the verification, right? You have this human in the loop inherently. And so now you're going through and you're saying, yes, this does match my query. No, this doesn't. And you can build systems that make that very efficient. And then this enables us to actually think about discovering new trends very, very quickly. I imagine this as just a different form of data collection. You already have sort of large scale data that was maybe collected for another purpose or a complementary purpose. And now you can think about very efficiently going in and finding relevant information to do some new sort of trend analysis. We've started probing this a bit with a bunch of different ecologists thinking about, what does this mean if you could search all the images on iNaturalist in a couple seconds? And so one example is we've been working with Marta Jarzina, and here we've been basically thinking about experiment design to efficiently be able to identify trends in avian diet for specific species. And what we found is that with like just a couple hours of effort, Marta and her team were able to nearly perfectly match the sort of hard-won trends in avian diet that were captured in the Savatraits database, which is, years of work by many, many different teams of researchers. So getting more out of data we already have, kind of getting at the bycatch in existing collected databases, I think is a really exciting use of this kind of language and imagery in this multimodal perspective. And then beyond that, I think the other way that people are thinking about using these LLMs, these generative models, is not using them directly, not just prompting an LLM and getting back some response, but actually thinking about using these generative models as a mechanism to actually write code. And in that way, if you build AI that writes and executes code, you can kind of constrain the system, but it also kind of unlocks a lot more analytical potential. So an early example of this was this model Viper GPT. So instead of prompting an LLM or a vision language model, how many muffins can each kid have for it to be fair? That's a little bit of a complex system. Instead, you can ask the model to generate code that tries to actually figure out what the logic should be to answer the question and then go through that logic line by line. So here, it's taking in image patches, it's finding all the image patches that have muffins in them, it's finding all the image patches that have kids in them, and then it's dividing the number of muffins by the number of kids to get you sort of the right amount for it to be fair, assuming fair means equal. And so this is like kind of a silly toy version. But essentially what this is doing is it's enabling you to build systems without necessarily requiring you to write a lot of code yourself that can enable much more complex reasoning. And the other thing that I think is quite exciting with this type of system is it helps you kind of be able to build in structure that forces your model to rely on real data and real functions and can help kind of reduce hallucinations, because these LLMs are trained to generate text that is likely, but not necessarily to generate text that is true. There's a difference between likely and true. And so there is a bunch of very exciting work thinking about building these agentic systems for biodiversity and planetary monitoring. One example is from the Land and Carbon Lab. This is a slide from Craig Mills, where they've been sort of combining together a bunch of those different representation models for different modalities of data, plus these kind of LLMs or agentic systems that will both retrieve relevant data, adding these things to their data panes, and then calculating things like trends. And I think we're really just scratching the surface of what this type of system might enable. And so I'm really excited about what this means for the future. And I think looking to the future and thinking about multimodal AI and how this is going to change biodiversity monitoring and change the way we think about impact assessment is, I think first, I think it's going to help us make better use of data we already have, either by sharing information across data, thinking about being able to understand which modalities are contributing to which decisions and which ways in a more systematic or more sort of rigorous way, so that we can actually think about targeting collection and using our resources more effectively. How do you decide what information should be collected where from which types of sensors to reduce our, to reduce our uncertainty in something like a species distribution model or some sort of like, global below ground carbon map. Additionally, I do think that there's a lot of information, ecological information in historic documents, in text, in different databases that are collected by different organizations that are in theory public information, but in practice are very, very hard to access. It's hard to find, it's hard to even find what information is out there, let alone actually directly access it and use it. And so I think potentially these types of systems, one way or another, are going to really help us better retrieve and analyze the information that's already been collected. I do think that all of this means that there is going to be a much, much larger need for validation and evaluation, rigorous methods for validation evaluation, particularly of these black box systems, because as analysis becomes kind of easier to do wrong, it also means that, if we're going to be kind of making decisions on the back of information that may or may not be correct, then I think a lot of the skill set that we'll need to look at in the future is not necessarily how do you do the analysis in the first place, but how do you take analysis and rigorously probe it to understand what biases it might capture, what limitations it might have, thinking about these systems specifically for evaluation and whether that actually also requires additional data collection, right? Targeted data collection, not for understanding, but for validation of extracted trends. And finally, I do think that ecologists of the future will need to be trained to work with AI. We're already seeing this. These systems are here to stay. And I think to be able to kind of keep up, there is a good amount of need for ecologists on the ground to have a familiarity and intuition about what these systems can or can't do, and to be able to make use of them effectively. Of course, there's a lot of complexity in that, but first and foremost, it does mean that we just need to think about the right mechanisms to build capacity in the ecological community, in the biodiversity community for working with these systems. And so I've been investing a lot of time and effort thinking about how do we teach ecologists AI. And I run a program called CV for Ecology that we're now working on our 4th year. And the call for applications is out currently, that really tries to think about empowering the next generation of ecologists to build their own scalable AI solutions for global conservation challenges, but where they're bringing their own problems, their own data, their own research, and they are the ones building the systems to use it. And we just finished doing a special version of this for laid off public sector employees in the US from, National Park Service, NOAA, USGS, et cetera. And we really found that, our pedagogy, the way we're teaching AI is changing as AI is changing. And so with this most recent version, we really spent a lot of time thinking about how to train ecologists to work with existing kind of like LLM-based or coding agents to be able to quickly get up to speed to train their own models. And so I do think that that's going to continue to change, but I'm quite excited about what it will sort of unblock in the future. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to discussing a bit more with Lily.
Thank you so much, Sara, for both highlighting the fantastic work that you've done in this space and also just giving us a broader overview of, the state of the art and what's possible and what could be possible with multimodal AI. It clearly has a lot of relevance and necessity for the questions that ecologists are asking. So thank you. I'll jump off what you were last talking about with capacity building and training. And I think what we've seen is in the past few years, many ecologists have invested a lot of time in learning about machine learning and figuring out how, they can train their own machine learning models and getting at these very like core foundational tools, and especially with what you are seeing with the updates that you've worked on for this new edition of CB for Ecology. Do you think there are opportunities for technological leapfrogging where people don't have to invest in learning like the basics, for example, of how to implement like a more bespoke machine learning model, for example, and instead they're interacting with these agentic systems. Where are those opportunities and where are potential pitfalls for, where we think that we might be able to, but instead there are still like core foundational background material that we have to first pick up?
Yeah, I think I mean, even from the beginning, the way we've been thinking about CV for ecology is not necessarily that we don't need to train ecologists to be AI researchers. They just need to be able to effectively and responsibly use the tools that are available. And in the last few years, I mean, even from the first versions of CV for ecology, the ability to sort of train a supervised like classification model on your data, if it's well labeled, that's not actually been very difficult. Now there is a lot of kind of upfront challenges in terms of like thinking about, how do I even access, like how do I get Python on my computer? How do I like pull from a Git repository? Like all of these kind of brass tacks stuff we found was taking a huge amount of time and was like a pretty big gap in terms of just like
Mhm.
core skills. But then the actual training of the machine learning models, that's really never been the challenge. Just because the tools have been getting better and better over the years. What I'm hoping is that some of that kind of like getting up to speed in terms of like,
Yeah.
do you need to have your own Python instantiation and access to your own GPU, or potentially, our system's going to come on board where you're just the one kind of structuring the system, and then all the kind of training and infrastructure and like data pipelining can be somewhat streamlined. And I think that will reduce a lot of kind of the just the complexity of getting started, the barrier to entry. So I think that's really exciting. But I think what will not change at all, whether the system is an agentic one or you're doing the code yourself, is the need for understanding about what these models are likely to learn, where they are likely to fail, how to evaluate them. Again, I brought up before the importance of
Mhm.
evaluation. It is very easy to do machine learning in a well-intended way and get results that are shockingly good, but wrong. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of the time we spend in that program when we're teaching people how to use AI is more about teaching them how to evaluate AI, teaching them to think about when
Yes.
and in what ways you need to do quality control. Like, what does quality control look like for a system that's semi-automated? And so uh, I think we're a long way from AI being able to appropriately evaluate itself. And so I think those types of skills, this intuition around what AI can and can't do, and what the like mechanisms to probe it are, I think will be
Yeah.
will continue to be the thing that we
Yeah.
really focus on when we teach.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And I guess another way of thinking about it is like the black box system, which is like the machine learning algorithm. Like that is still a black box and we can just ignore it, but it's really the infrastructural setup, the like, the what software do I have? How do I run something? And on the other end, it's like getting in these concepts like thinking about overfitting and what
Hmm.
does performance mean and when can I generalize and when can I not? Those
Yeah.
are the types of questions that we really need to build intuition around. So, but hopefully, hopefully those are things that don't require intense technological sophistication, but rather it's more of higher level thinking that, ecologists are very used to thinking about in their own context already.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
okay. So a question I'll ask that is very, going across the whole of what your talk was about is a very basic question of like, when is something multimodal versus not? So, for
Yeah.
example, there's some examples that you talked about where it's bringing in imagery and text, for example, that feels very intuitive. But another one of the examples that you gave was, I believe, the Presto model, where there's
Mhm.
many different modalities of remote sensing imagery coming in. But why is that multimodal whereas, before when, in more old school machine learning algorithms, we would have, these feature vectors where every feature refers to something different. And, maybe one is like uh, an age, another one is, some other type of
Oh,
measurement. Um,
yeah.
like, why is that not multimodal?
I think that is multimodal. There's no reason that wouldn't be. It's not that we've never done multimodality before. I was talking about how, there's been decades of work in terms of figuring out how to
Mhm.
model across different modalities. Those features can come from different modalities. Um, I think that people often overload terms or kind
Yeah.
of weakly misused terms, but my perspective is that multimodality is talking about basically just bringing information from different sources. And one of the actually like fights I've gotten in, not fights, debates, is whether optical imagery from a drone and optical imagery on the ground are multimodal or
Mm,
multi-view. And I feel like
mm,
it's a little bit splitting hairs, and I'm just calling
yeah.
it multimodal because like they're different sensors and it's kind of like an easy way for me to keep track of it. But I guess technically, in some ways, like they're both capturing like optical data through a lens. So like, you know, um, I agree.
Well,
It's a slightly multi-use term. You could say multimodal or multi-view. I think the point from my perspective is just like you're capturing information from different sources.
so now that we understand what multimodality is, um, I wanted to ask, what are distinctions and specific challenges and specific opportunities with multimodality for biodiversity versus other application where it's used in? And I think ones I've heard more of are in healthcare and robotics. But what do you see as perhaps like both challenges and opportunities that are unique to biodiversity data?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's like a fundamental difference at like a high meta level in terms of like if you're collecting a lot of different types of data for a given problem, like there is arguably potential to capture and share information across those different types of data. I think some of the things that make biodiversity as an application kind of unique is both kind of the structure, the complexity of the systems that we're trying to study, which then by default means that there's a huge amount of diversity and heterogeneity in the
Mhm.
different types of data we're collecting to try to study that system. Um, so the right modalities of information to map the right like types of information to map like forest cover are very, very different from the right types of information to like model, you know, species diversity of beetles or something
Mhm.
like, the genetic diversity within a species. And so I do think that part of what makes multimodality so exciting or so interesting in biodiversity is the fact that the modalities we're talking about are very diverse. They're often very structured in complex ways. So it's not like
Mhm.
a bunch of different types of data going into some sort of table where you have some sort of like tabular structure where things can be easily registered. Like you have these
Mhm.
complex questions around like how do you decide what the relationship between like a camera trap image taken a year ago, 100 feet away from a like acoustic signal today, is like what's the right way to kind of represent or register or share information, given that these things are geospatial and
Mhm.
heterogeneous and capturing different sort of perspectives of different types of information across different taxa. So I think we just have a more complicated multimodal problem than if you have something like an image and text describing that image that are like obviously co-registered. And that kind of like complex question around what is the right way to think about like relationships across space and time, is I think one thing that makes this very unique.
Fantastic. Yeah, and certainly the broad, the literal planet scale spatial scope, and the very fine-grained temporal scope, like as you mentioned, about bioacoustic data that's being collected by the millisecond, and remote sensing data that's being collected by the day. It just vast tombs of information that surpasses what we have in many other contexts. Um, Okay, one of the points that you made that I thought was really exciting about opportunities with multimodal AI is that each one of these sensors are good, have their own strengths that are often complementary. So you gave the example of citizen science versus like camera traps that are intended to be put in remote areas, for example. So where do you see as like creative like sophisticated ways to combine and synthesize this information. You mentioned, I believe, using a mixture of experts to determine which of these like knowledge sources to use for different kinds of questions. So how can we systematically think about how to combine these data sources and identify what their strengths or weaknesses are?
Yeah, this gets at this really interesting kind of question around like what is the value of data? Like, what is how do different data points contribute to decisions or analyses, even if we aren't going quite to the level of decisions?
Mhm.
Um, and I think so you brought up the camera trap and citizen science example. Well, it would be, you could imagine like if you have the registration, if you have both of these types of data collected in the same places in the same times, then you could think about doing some sort of really systematic study of like which ones are contributing which value to which downstream tasks.
Mhm.
Um, so for example, like if you need to understand the spatial occupancy of a species, over all time versus you want to understand the spatiotemporal occupancy of a species. So how are they moving seasonality,
Mhm.
like relative to seasonality? Um, these two different types of data, so like citizen science data, which is opportunistic and
Mhm.
potentially not captured as consistently over space and time versus something that's a much more kind of
Yeah.
standardized and rigorous sampling and has
Yeah, and they
known
have their own
effort.
spatial biases, like they
Yeah.
collect more data on the weekends and like summer holidays.
Yeah, and they collect more data like yeah, like there's a huge dip in iNaturalist data collection every time it rains. Like there's just a lot of like complexity. And so there, I think like when you're talking about the value of the information, it gets quite complex. Even if you have perfectly overlapped information from the two types of sensors, where you could then at least do some sort of experimental analysis of kind of like,
Mhm.
okay, if you're trying to predict, some other downstream thing, and those could be really diverse. I think, okay, a bit of an aside, but I think if you're talking about the value of data, it's incredibly
Yeah.
contextualized, right? So some data is going to be very valuable for occupancy prediction, but not
Mhm.
necessarily add much if you're trying to just do something like satellite data based tree canopy height. Like maybe you don't get a lot of additional valuable information about the height of trees from like I don't know, camera trap data on the ground. Or maybe you do because you can see something about like the scale of the trunks in the background. But like
Mhm.
this question of like what data contributes what value to what downstream task in what biome, for what species, I think is a really interesting one and one that we have very little transparency on. And so I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. I have kind of as like a thrust of research in my group is like actually trying to think about what is the systematic framework? What are the ways that we can start to build a more rigorous understanding of the relative value of data
Mhm.
and not just the first order value, like kind of the second order value. Like if I have a picture at a given time
Yeah.
and place that maybe carries value and maybe doesn't, if you have another picture taken at almost the exact same time and
Mhm.
place versus if you don't have any other data points from nearby,
Yeah.
right? And then, add, the complexity of these different modalities of data as well on top of that. So, the value is not just independent, it's actually contextualized by what other data is available. So I think it's very difficult to do this, systematically, but it's something that we're
Yeah.
trying to do. And we've been partnering with a bunch of organizations around the world who are collecting multimodal data, for a given site and have sort of very specific, well-grounded tasks of interest that are based on decisions they have to make, and trying to actually just at least across a bunch of these different diverse areas, understand like which modalities of data collected in what ways, when, are contributing how to what downstream tasks. So taking a bit of an experimental approach to it with real data, but just trying to get this first pass of like, how do we think about value? And then I think one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by this question of like, what value do data points add is we don't have unlimited resources, right? We do not
Mhm.
have unlimited resources in biodiversity. And I think we collect way more data than we need in
Yeah.
some places and not nearly enough data in others. Like, and when I say then we need, I mean like I work with a ton of organizations that have collected millions of camera traps, thousands of hours of bioacoustics, and maybe a lot of it hasn't ever been processed. If it has been
Yeah.
processed and processed to the level of like a species occurrence, and they're keeping it and they've collected it because they think there might be more things they can do, but it's not clear. And it definitely isn't being used for more things yet. And I think
Mhm.
there's both potential to try to make use of that data, make better use of that data, but also like I think we're wasting a bunch of human effort and power and energy on kind of like duplicative data.
Yeah.
Like um yeah, like the tree canopy height example. Like if your goal is to measure the height of trees in a given area, um, there's probably like an optimal set of sort of sampling and modalities of data that would get you as efficiently as
Mhm.
possible. If you're talking about just the cost of deployment and collection and processing, to the thing that you actually care about within some margin of error that is reasonable to you. And so I think we're a really long way away from being able to like do this rigorously everywhere. But I think it's a really important thing that we need to better understand because I want to see AI actually add value. And I think I've seen a lot of
Mhm.
examples of AI adding hype. And I've seen a few
Yeah.
examples of AI really concretely adding value to biodiversity projects. And I would like to see that sort of value versus cost trade-off of like using these types of technologies shift more towards value.
Fantastic. Um, Okay, so on the topic of modalities, and to be a little bit more future looking of thinking about, what what should we invest in? What kind of data do we still need? Are there any kind of burgeoning upcoming sense modes of data collection of like new sensors, for example, that you know are coming on the horizon that you're very excited about? And one, for example, that I hear mentioned repeatedly is eDNA.
Mhm.
But I'm curious, if that is an area that you find particularly exciting, or if there are other types of data that has been under, not yet reached the mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, I also agree that eDNA seems particularly exciting. I think, uh, I think one of the things that's so exciting about eDNA is it's not necessarily as taxonomically biased as many of these other modalities. So, depending on how or sort of what you're sort of, extracting meta barcodes from, you can kind of get evidence of everything from, the largest to the smallest species kind of in a single process, which I think is very exciting. But like all other modalities of data, the challenge with like it has its challenges, right? And so with with um, with any sort of genetic type of sensing, the challenge is that if you find evidence genetically of a species, it doesn't mean that the species was there when you sampled the data. It means that some genetic part of that species got there at some point within the degradation window of that gene, right? And
Yeah. But
so,
sometimes the degradation window is very short. It's like a
yeah,
day or a few hours in certain climates. So I think that's part of what makes people really excited about it. But of course, you're right in
but
that
that's a
other
lot
types of
less
climates, especially like
true
polar,
in
for
the
example.
ocean or in the air.
Mhm.
And like so I think yeah, I mean I'm not saying this doesn't make it valuable. I'm saying that the statistics we need, the way we need to understand like what sampling effort looks like in this sort of context is quite different. And I think that those are being really actively explored and is very, very exciting. And I think I mean, similarly, I think that there's like this kind of cool way to think about like how do you incorporate something like genetic presence
Yeah.
and then understanding enough about sort of these degradation windows and these different climates and for these different species for different types of genetic evidence so you could build kind of like the range at which that thing was likely to be sort of actually discovered, but then you could build that directly into sort of your multimodal representations, right? So I think as we get more information about what it means to have like evidence
Mhm.
from DNA, I think it's going to like be just another really complementary piece of information. And particularly when you think about verification, right? Because somehow like if I'm like predicting something like a global species distribution model for, 100,000 different species simultaneously, being able to go out and, collect a few samples and then just say like, which of these species do we or do we not have any evidence for anywhere in this area? Like, I think it's a cool way to think about like almost like a confirmation of likelihood as opposed to like trying to directly model something like abundance from DNA.
Fantastic. Okay. So we're nearing the end, but I wanted to go back to a point that you made earlier in talk, Sarah, which was about opportunities with agentic AI to actually given some input text prompt for the system to automatically write code to help answer a query. And the cute example that you gave, a child. But also going uh, off of some of the points that you're making about the need for verification. So, the more complex these systems get when we're actually, not having systems that are writing code, like how and when can someone like an ecologist actually trust that these types of agentic systems are doing the task? We would write an algorithm and we would evaluate it and would say, this is how well this algorithm does in this specific training example. And, we can measure the performance against, uh, other baseline algorithms, for example. But now with an agentic system, all of that is being black boxed out. So we're not no longer doing any kind of built-in evaluation systems. So where do we find ways to trust these systems?
As these systems become increasingly black boxed, and now it's not just kind of what the model is learning that's black boxed, it's actually like the parameters to set it up and like what sort of data it's accessing, and like there's so many more things that are maybe unknowns. And I think that the only way we are going to be able to trust outputs from systems like this is if we are, as part of like almost the experiment design, like systematically designing evaluation frameworks for those systems, right? This actually has to be built in from the beginning. We can't just like generate analysis and use it. And actually, once the analysis has been generated, like we should have a plan for, okay, well, what are the ways that we're going to probe this system? And I think that can take a lot of different forms, right? It can take the form of like, okay, you have some carefully, held out data that you're going to evaluate different components of the system on. The nice thing is if you're asking these systems in an agentic way, not to generate answers, but to generate the code that generates answers, then you can also ask them to generate unit tests for that code. And then you can provide examples for those unit tests that probe the accuracy of the different individual components of the system. And so I think you want to build in that transparency by design. And I I would strongly recommend that nobody just sort of like writes to an agentic AI system like, can you tell me the population trend of this endangered species in this area? Like, that is not science. We know how to be scientists. Like, you have to think about how do you ensure that your science is in fact correct. And I would honestly, I mean, I think it's like anthropomorphizing maybe a bit too much, but like think of it like peer review. If you're doing like good peer review of someone else's science, like what are the ways you convince yourself that the choices they made in their analysis are reasonable and correct? That they've kind of chosen to process their data in a way that is reasonable and correct. So we have these skills, but we should be using them in these cases for sure.
Wonderful, Sarah. So I think we're reaching the end, but one last question that I would love to hear from you is how do we think about privacy implications of the data that's being collected? And are there, opportunities to perhaps use approaches like federated machine learning in order to maintain data sovereignty for the people who are collecting data going to?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. I think essentially what we see across the board is that like there's this argument that AI adds value, and that in order to harness the value of that AI, you need to give up some amount of sovereignty over the data. I think that that's a little bit of a misnomer. I think there are definitely cases where, for example, like you don't see the same benefits from AI if you've been collecting data in a system that just hasn't been well represented in the training data, or you're interested in a species that's not well represented. And I think one of the only ways that we see kind of those AI systems get better in those cases is through mechanisms of sharing and pooling data. But that doesn't need to be one versus all. We found in our experiments that there is a significant, if you're looking at sort of the relative information gain or sort of the relative value gain of using AI, regional collaboration is actually much more important than global collaboration. And so I think there's mechanisms for thinking about what kind of like regional level data sharing looks like that is not necessarily kind of enforcing that everything needs to be global. I do think that like the concept behind federated learning is a really exciting one, which is like this idea that you're not actually sharing the data itself. You're sharing sort of like model weights or sort of different types of structure back and forth that are preserving the privacy of your own data, but enabling sort of everyone's global benefit from the kind of different like things the model can learn across all of that data. In practice, it's too expensive. We do not have a way to do federated learning that is at all matching like the realities of what it means to do ecology on the ground. We don't even have GPUs in these places or bandwidth to send the data anyway, like, and let alone something where now you actually have to have sufficient bandwidth to be sending really large like model weights back and forth and sort of actively be running this system in real time in all these different ways. So I think that the idea of federated learning is a promising one, but I think we have a long way to go before it becomes practically usable in the types of systems we're looking at. And I would just point out here that like federated learning has sounded promising for years, but we've yet to figure out how to do it well across hospitals in the US that have incredibly large profit margins and a huge amount of infrastructure and expertise. Like if we can't figure out how to like effectively do federated learning in high resource scenarios within a sort of a smaller kind of regional complexity, I think we should wait for them to figure it out first before we sort of try to encourage very resource limited folks to be investing in that right now on the ground. But machine learning researchers, this is a really interesting, complicated problem. So if you're working on federated learning, I would encourage you to try to figure out what is the way that federated learning works for ecology.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for helping us think through those practical considerations, like both what's practical technically as well as bureaucratically, and with policy and geographic constraints. So I think we'll close it off there. But thank you so much, Sara, for sharing your work, for doing this work in the first place, and really looking forward to continuing this series.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lily. It's always fun to get to talk to you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing all the other talks. All right, bye.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.